Today's lesson is rotations around the origin. There will be some notes you need to take, so make sure you have your notebook out and let's go. So the first thing that you want to make sure you have with rotations is that you understand that it is a turn and that you understand the language. So CW we use for clockwise. That's when we go around the clock, the way the clock goes. So you would start with your 12 and then 3 and 6 and 9. And we'll be focusing on quarter rotations and half rotations. So 90 degrees would be that right angle from 12 to 3 or 3 to 6 or 6 to 9. And then counterclockwise is CCW. And that would be where we start with our 12, but we go backwards, that 90-degree angle backwards to 9 and then to 6 and so on. So what you want to know is that your XY coordinate, whatever it is, you see that your Y and your X will flip and your X becomes the opposite of what it was. We'll see that. We practiced this in class too, with the paper where we rotated it. 180 degrees, clockwise or counterclockwise, is the same thing. So your X and your Y, they negate. And then your 90 degrees counterclockwise, that CCW, they flip and your Y becomes negative. So we'll look at a few examples, but I would write this down in your notebook so you have this to refer to going forward. So pause this video to take time to do that or plan to come back. So remembering our vocabulary, a rotation is a transformation that turns the figure around a fixed point. So that fixed point for us is going to be the origin. In simple language, a rotation is a turn. And we saw that when we practiced with the paper in class. So things in the real world, a merry-go-round, a Ferris wheel, the Earth's rotation, and think of other things that you might be aware of. That could be an example in real life. So just something to keep in mind, this is a nice visual for us. A rotation is like tipping a rectangle on its side. We won't be drawing rectangles, but I want you to kind of see that to go from A to A primed, we just flipped it over on its side. So you can imagine something has turned over. So we'll look at that in our next examples. The other thing to notice is that to go from A to A primed, you have a 90-degree angle. You're rotating at that quarter turn. So going here, this would be a CCW, counterclockwise. And if you imagine your clock here, 12, 3, 6, and 9, you're going this way. You're counterclockwise from A to A primed. Remember, if you were to rotate this again, you would call it a double primed. So let's get going. So this gives us the solution and the problem on the same page. And I want to have that so that you can see how we arrived at the solution. So right now we're going 90 degrees counterclockwise. So to establish what that means, maybe put your clock on the top. So you've got your 12, 3, 6, and 9, and pretend that's a clock and say, oh, we're going this way, one turn. So kind of remind yourself, one turn. 90 degrees. That means every point on here is going to turn 90 degrees. Now, you know that when it's counterclockwise, it's the same as 270 degrees clockwise because you're either doing 1/4 one direction or 3/4 the other direction. It's more efficient to think about it as 90 degrees counterclockwise, and what you know is your X and Y flip and your Y becomes negative. So I'll use point K as our example. So K right now is -1, -2. So my X and Y need to flip. So -1, -2. My X and Y need to flip. So I'd have 2 and 1 just to start because I know my Y negates. So my Y used to be -2, so now it'll be +2. And my X stays the same, but it gets moved into the Y spot. So let's see what happens. So now that would be a 2 and then a -1. So if I go over here, I can say 2 and then -1, and I would call that K primed. My P would be the same thing. So my P is 1, 2, 3, 4, -2. So they're going to flip spaces. So my 4, -2 is now going to be 2, 4 as far as switching because my y becomes opposite. So my y turns into positive 2 and my x just relocates. So now I actually am going to have my p is going to be 2, 4. So p primed. And you have the benefit of the answer over here, so you can see that I would just keep repeating that process. So there's my K, there's my P. Over here, you can see the same thing. So the shape will rotate in space. It's like you've turned it. So let's look at another one. So now we are rotating 100 degrees, 180 degrees around the origin. This is where it doesn't matter which way you go. So I'm going to mark my clock. And I know I have to go 2 turns. So twice I'm going to turn for that 180 degrees. This one's actually, in my mind, the easiest one because all we do is negate our x and y. So if we have the point 0, 1, now we're going to have the point 0, negative 1. So that would be g primed. If we have the point negative 1, 3, now we're going to have the point 1, negative 3. That would be my h point, h primed. And if we have the point negative 4, 0, then we have the point 4, 0. So that would be my s primed. And we would draw our shape. One thing you want to realize is this is a rigid motion. That means its size and its shape stay the same, but it has just moved in space. So that 180 degrees clockwise or counterclockwise would be the same thing. It's 2 turns. Now, what if we go 90 degrees clockwise around the origin? Again, draw your clock and say, oops, 9 goes here, and say that you are going 1 turn to the right. Okay, so everybody's going to go 1 turn to the right. So again, your things are going to switch. And you can always use the paper to draw that and see and turn it when you're on a piece of paper, but your x and y will switch. So you've got this coordinate negative 1, negative 2 for j is negative 1, negative 2. So we need to switch. And I'm just going to do this time with erasing. So I would have negative 2 and negative 1. And notice my x becomes the opposite of what it was. So negative 2 and then positive 1. I'll just put the plus there. It's easier for me. So now my j primed is negative 2, negative 1. So I end up with j primed. Notice that that is the same that I see over here. So you can see that we just rotate it. Okay, so now we have one that we need to rotate 90 degrees clockwise about the origin. So I'm going to again put my clocks on here, 12, 3, 6, and 9, just because I feel like it. And I'll remind myself that clockwise goes this way. Now remember, our rule is when we go 90 degrees clockwise, our y and our x switch, and our x turns the opposite of what it was. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to just label everything on the graph. So you now see that everything here is labeled. All of them have coordinates, and I have spots where I can reverse them. So I'm going to keep that same color, and I'm going to reverse my x and y for the y. So instead of 4, 3, it will be 3, 4, and then I know that my x has to be the opposite of what it was, so it's 3, negative 4. And then my k primed, I reverse them, so it'll be 3, 5. My x is the opposite, so I am going to reverse that. My b is 5, 0, so it'll be 0, 5. And my x becomes the opposite, so it's negative 5. And my u is 2, negative 2, so now this one's kind of trickier. So my y switches places that negative 2. My x goes here and reverses. Now, I want to take a minute to talk to you about quadrants. You've all learned quadrants, and you can remember that this is quadrant 1, and then it goes counterclockwise, so that quadrant 2, quadrant 3, and quadrant 4. And this can help you a lot with knowing where to expect yours to land. So quadrant 1, everything in quadrant 1 is always positive. So my x is positive and my y is positive. So one way to note that is just my x and then my y, but a better way to keep it straight would be just positive, positive. So I'm going to do that in the future. So when I go to quadrant 2, my x would be negative because I'm going left on the x, and my y remains positive because it's still above the 0. And then my quadrant 3, both of them are negative. And then my quadrant 4, I have a positive x and a negative y. So if you look here, you can see that all of these have a positive x, or in one case a 0x, and then a negative y. So they are going to be in that quadrant 2. And then my u is going to expect to be in that quadrant 3 where we have a negative negative. So you can kind of be aware ahead of time where things will go. Now this has gotten really crowded, so I do encourage you to say, oh, I'll take a minute and maybe write a graph of those quadrants and note their signs, but I'm going to go ahead and erase all this so that there's room for our new picture. And I'm also going to erase all the coordinates so that they're not in our way. So they're gone. And now I'll draw my new one, and I'm going to go ahead and use the green for that. So 3, negative 4 is my new one. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 4. And I'll just say y primed. And then 3, negative 5. So I'm going to undo where I put y primed and put it on the other side because k primed is right here. B primed would be 0, negative 5. Right over here. And I'm wondering if I messed up something. It looks to me like I did, so I can see immediately that that k does not look right. It's 3, negative 5. So I say to myself, oh, I went over 4. So 3, negative 5 would be my k primed. So I would have been okay after all. And then my u primed is negative 2, negative 2. So when I draw this, I should expect something that is the same shape. It is a rigid motion. So I'll put my y primed here. And it looks to me like it's going to be the same shape. So I have not done anything wrong. It looks like it's a nice drawing. Now notice, and I'm going to draw this in here, that my YK portion of this started off in quadrant 1, and now it ended up in quadrant 2, just like we expected it to. And then my U primed started off here in quadrant 3, and in quadrant 2, and it went over to quadrant 3. So when it does that rotation, it rotates over a quadrant, and that is really helpful. So again, going back and knowing that quadrant 1 is positive, positive, that's our quadrant 1. Quadrant 2 is negative, positive. Quadrant 3 is negative, negative, and quadrant 4 is positive, negative. I would write that in your notes. So now look at our answer and then see if we have it correct. Yes. So now you'll head off and you're going to practice. You'll have some assignments and hopefully you'll get really comfortable with this. If you have not made notes of what the rules are, please take time to do that. Go back and watch this video and then you'll have it right next to you when you're doing the practice.